Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife. Today's guest is William Robichaud, who has been working on wildlife conservation and research in Southeast Asia for nearly 25 years. He is also the founder of the Saola working group. And if you're not familiar with what a Saola is, you're not alone. Basically, it's this 150 to 200 pound mammal that has been living in the forests of Southeast Asia, but wasn't discovered by scientists until the early 1990s. It's critically endangered. There's estimates of less than 100 left in the world. And for those reasons, it's been dubbed the Asian unicorn. Bill has literally taken it upon himself to help protect the entire fate of this species. Jeremy Hance, who has been on the podcast, introduced me to Bill as basically the Saola's last chance. So the work that he is doing is so important, so necessary, so meaningful. And the conversation was really fun and very interesting. A lot about the Saola, but I even go off on a tangent and talk about how we're all going to become cyborgs, which might be a little too science fiction, but it was fun. I also wanted to note really quickly that I talk about the International Ocean Film Festival, which I attended a few weeks ago, and I saw a screening of Sharkwater Extinction, which is one of the best wildlife documentaries that I have seen probably ever. Yes, ever. And the filmmaker, when I talk about it in the podcast, I could not recall his name. It's actually Rob Stewart. And Rob Stewart, unfortunately, recently passed. And he was such a prolific filmmaker and conservationist that I really highly recommend everybody watch all of his films. He was an absolutely amazing man. And I'll stop talking. Let's get into it. It's a really great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only William Robichaud. Well, Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to be here. I'm super excited for this conversation because I always find it fascinating to read articles about new species being discovered. But most of the time it's the smaller species, right? Insects, rodents, frogs, etc. And you've worked with a large terrestrial mammal that has been dubbed the Asian unicorn that nobody discovered until, what was it, the late 1990s? Can you talk a little bit about it? You just told me how to pronounce it. I think it's Saola. Is that how, am I saying it right?
Very good.
Okay, I've learned
Daniel.
quickly. It's spelled Saola, but can you talk a little bit about what the Saola is and why it took so long to be discovered?
So you're right. It was probably the most surprising zoological find of the 20th century because, as you said, it's a big animal. It's about the size of a white-tailed deer, 150 to 200 pounds.
Wow.
And it's not just a new species. It's an entirely new mammalian genus, this big. So like you said, there's new species being discovered all the time. But usually there are new species of something else, a new species of this type of squirrel, or even this type of monkey or fish or whatever. Mm-hmm. This was an entirely new scientific genus of an animal that looks like nothing known from Southeast Asia and it weighs 150 pounds. Villagers in its range, which is the Annamite Mountains along the border of Laos and Vietnam, of course, they knew about it. But it wasn't found by the outside world until 1992 by some biologists in Vietnam, some Vietnamese biologists and a British guy, John McKinnon. Up until then, even Vietnamese biologists in Hanoi didn't know about it.
Wow.
This just blew the minds of biologists around the world that an animal this big and this distinctive could go undetected by the outside world into the closing years of the 20th century. The reasons for it, as you can imagine, in the 1960s and 70s, there were not a lot of people running around the border forest of Laos and Vietnam looking for wildlife.
Yeah.
And then after the Vietnam War ended and Laos and Vietnam both installed communist governments, they pretty much had enough of foreign interference in their countries. So they largely closed the countries down, except to like advisors from the East Bloc countries and the Soviet Union and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I have a colleague of mine, he's now passed away, was Vladimir Flint. He was like this great Russian ornithologist, and he published like the 10 or 12 volume book on the birds of the USSR. And after the Saola was discovered, I saw him, and we were having some drinks. He says, Bill, this surprised us too, because we Russians, we had biologists doing some surveys in Vietnam in the 1980s after the Vietnam War, and we never found the Saola either. And the French, Laos and Vietnam, what's now Laos and Vietnam, was a French colony for about 100 years. And some French guys did surveys in Laos and Vietnam. They never found it either. So, yeah, it was amazing.
And can you describe for listeners what it looks like?
There's a Saola. So your listeners who can't see it, its scientific genus name is Pseudo-oryx. Because if any of your listeners know what an oryx looks like, these are these large antelopes from North Africa and the Middle East. And they're these big, beautiful animals with very long, pointed horns. In a Saola, they're about 2 feet long, about 60 centimeters. And it's got this beautiful pattern of white spots on the side of the face and like white eyebrow and white pasterns. So it's beautiful. It's got these long, sweeping horns and these white spots on the face. And as they said, it looks like something from Africa. And I think when these guys first found it, what happened, they were this team of Vietnamese biologists and this guy, John McKinnon. They just went to do a general biodiversity and wildlife survey in a small protected area on the Laos border in Vietnam called Vu Quan. And one day, one of the Vietnamese team members, he hiked into a nearby village to try to buy some fresh vegetables for their field camp. And while he was in the village, he noticed these spectacular long horns nailed to the wall of the house of a hunter in the village. And, like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
I think maybe they first suspected it might have been something from Africa that some French guy had brought in 50 years ago, and then it just got traded up as a curio to this village. But no, they found multiple sets of these horns, and some of them still had some like fresh flesh adhering to them. So they knew this thing was from there, and it was still out there in the forest.
Wow, what an amazing feeling that must be, right? To be a biologist, clearly have an understanding of taxonomy, right. like way beyond the comprehension of a normal individual, and to stumble upon this skull and be like, holy shit, that thing could still be out there.
Yeah. And the name Saola, it's actually a Lao word. It's the only international animal name that comes to the Lao language. It's a name that basically means old spinning wheel posts or spinning wheel arms, because in the Lao language, a little local spinning wheel that villagers use up in the mountains where Saola lives, it's called a la. And Sao means any kind of a post or an arm, like the legs of a table or the sao of a table. It means post or arm. So Saola are the posts of the spinning wheel that hold up the drum on which you spin on the thread, the silk or cotton thread. And these tapered arms are about the same size and shape as a Saola's horns.
Oh, interesting.
So the villagers have always called it old spinning wheel posts, is what its name means.
Oh, wow. That's super interesting.
At least in the Lao language, that's what the name means.
And so when these biologists saw the skulls, they turned to the villagers and said, hey, what is this? They say, oh, it's a Saola. And where did they go? Yeah. Where did they go from there? Is it something that most villagers knew about? Was it pretty commonplace, or is it something that they'd stumble upon once in a blue moon?
Yeah, so I mean, they knew it. So it wasn't anything. Yeah, they asked the villagers, what's this? And they said, they were in Vietnam, so they might have given a different name. But yeah, they just said, oh, it's a Saola. They said, what's a Saola? They said, well, it's this large animal running around the forest with all the wild pigs and the deer and the leopards. And they didn't know it was anything. The villagers had known it all their lives. It was just part of their local fauna. So they didn't know it was anything unusual. But even villagers say, and that's why we kind of got the nickname Asian unicorn. Even villagers don't see it very often. I mean, even back then, they didn't see it very often. It took, even though the technology wasn't that great, it took 6 years after the animal's discovery to get the first wild camera trap photograph of it.
6 years?
So 6 years. It wasn't until 1998 that the first wild photograph. It's by far the largest terrestrial animal of certain existence, other than Yeti or Sasquatch.
Yeah.
That's probably never been seen in the wild by a biologist.
It's like, have you ever heard of the orang pendek? That's over.
Yeah. Buddy of mine, Jeremy Holden, says he's seen one.
Really?
He works on that thing down in Indonesia. I asked him about it once because he was like working on camera trapping. I said, what do you think of this thing? And Jeremy's very credible, and he just looked at me and said, I know it's there because I saw one.
And it's supposedly,
this is a guy who's a biologist.
It's like an orangutan Bigfoot kind of creature, right?
Yeah, and I think they interpreted, people know what a gibbon is. A gibbon is a lesser ape. There's multiple species of gibbons in Southeast Asia. But they're almost completely arboreal. They're just up in the trees. They swing through the trees. The theory is this is some sort of terrestrial gibbon, or a gibbon that comes to the ground.
Yeah, I had a podcast with this guy, Greg McCann, who does a lot of work in Cambodia. And he said he's talked to some credible folks that he's worked with for 10 plus years in those rainforests. And they swear that they've seen it before, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah. You got right. In Indonesia or in Cambodia?
Oh, sorry. It was, he works in...
There's something... all of these countries have their own animals. Laos, they have pikangkoi.
Sorry, I did mess that up. He works in Sumatra is where he saw it, I think.
Yeah, that's their ring.
He spends his time between Sumatra and Cambodia, and I swapped the two.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
So that's what's cool about Saola. It's almost... it's not a primate, but it's not a bipedal primate, but it's still amazing. And we know it's out there. We have photographs of it. I spent about 3 weeks with a captive many years ago. We've seen dead ones. We're still getting, evidence of it.
Has anyone seen it in the wild? Like as a
biologist? Well, there's an amazing Russian biologist who we hired actually to help us do some surveys. And last January, and he goes out with a thermal imager, and this guy is just an amazing, check out his website sometime, Vladimir Dinets, Dinets. He just has an amazing talent for seeing mammals and other things in the wild that nobody's ever seen and confirming it. He's not a charlatan. So we thought maybe we can find a Saola. And he's fairly certain he saw one. He got a thermal image of a large animal behind a tree, and then he kind of looked and you could see these long horns kind of sticking out around the tree. He's not, I don't think, absolutely certain, but he's fairly confident he did. And villagers are telling us, they still see them. But unfortunately, it's been in decline ever since it was discovered. And it's probably the most endangered large mammal in the world. There's Sumatran rhino, which is highly endangered, but at least there's a captive insurance population of several Sumatran rhinos. There's no Saola in captivity. It's not safe anywhere in its range from poaching. And as best we can guess, there's almost certainly fewer than 100 left in the wild, just spread out through this big mountain range. So it's getting towards the knife edge of extinction.
How do you determine something like that obviously it's critically endangered, from the sense that you have this 200-pound mammal going through the rainforest and you don't see them particularly often? They're definitely not doing particularly well, but how can you tell that they're declining if the camera trap footage is so hard to come by?
Right. Well, one thing we know is that it's based on there's a few different vectors we bring together. One is the frequency with which local people say they see it now compared to 20 years ago.
Okay.
They see it much less common. Some areas where they were reporting seeing it 20 years ago, now it's gone. Subpopulations have winked out. The other thing is the frequency with which we get camera trap photographs of it. It's now really difficult to find even through camera trapping. Back in 1998, 99, when I was doing camera trapping for it on the Laos side of the border, just about the time these colleagues and friends of mine got the first photographs in Vietnam. Like we were kind of in this little race, and they scooped us. They got the first photos.
Yeah.
But we got our photos, and ours are much nicer, actually. The photo we got is the most beautiful photo of us. It is. It's the most beautiful wild photo of Saola ever taken.
I'll link that. I've seen, it's the one with the green, like a lot of greenery in the background. He's kind of like in a little meadow.
Yeah.
Yeah. For listeners, I'm going to link to all these photos as well as your colleague that you talked about before. Everything can be found in the show notes if people want more info on this.
So it's the photo of it's an animal in the open standing in a stream, like looking at the camera. And when I took the photo back and showed it to the villagers who helped me get the photo and place the camera trap, as soon as they saw it, they said, "Oh, William," said, "that's a pregnant that's a female. She's really pregnant." Because if you look at the photo, the belly's quite distended. And they said, "That's not the normal profile of a Saola. That's a heavily pregnant female."
Wow.
And from what we know, the timing is about right when we think Saolas would be pregnant. But in any case, when we got these, when we were doing this project, we were using, back then the technology wasn't as good. It was all film cameras. The batteries only lasted for a month. You could only take 36 pictures on a film roll. They were susceptible to moisture. I mean, the technology is so much better now. And I only started with 10 cameras, and they were kind of breaking down, and I was down to 4.
Yeah.
In the last setting, when the project had to end, we put these last 4 camera traps out. Actually, the villagers set them themselves. And I had pretty much given up by then. I said, okay, one last shot. We only got 4 camera traps left. We had 2 photos of Saola on these last 4 cameras from different areas.
Wow.
Now we've got 300 camera traps out in Laos trying to get photographs of it. And it's tougher getting pictures of it. Those 300 camera traps.
Yeah. So
that gives you, and also the other vector is the frequency with which we see signs of, so what's going on in all this is it's not habitat loss. There's still plenty of the forested habitat of Saola, far more than there are Saolas in that forest and other animals. So Southeast Asia, especially in Laos and Vietnam, they're suffering from this empty forest syndrome. Maybe you've heard that term.
I have, yeah, but can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, so you go into a beautiful forest in the Annamite Mountains of Laos and Vietnam, and it looks structurally intact. It's beautiful. All the trees are there, all the vegetation. A lot of the birds may be there. But you walk around, and there's no sign of any animal bigger than a bread box. They've all, especially animals on the ground, because they've been wiped out by snaring, by the setting of hundreds of thousands of wire snares. And this isn't local people doing it for food. It's driven by the commercial demand for animals valued in traditional Chinese medicine or in luxury wildlife meat restaurants in the urban centers of Hanoi and Laos and other places.
So it's like
the prices are
it's like the rainforest equivalent of like drift nets, right? Like you throw out these drift nets in the ocean that literally capture anything that swims into it within 2 miles. Yeah. So even though the Chinese medicine traditionally doesn't value a Saolas still get trapped in the same snares that are catching the things that do like the bears for their gallbladders and things like that.
Yeah,
that's
exactly. So Saola is being wiped out as bycatch, and while it's sad and a tragedy, I think it also gives us a little hope to saving this animal from extinction, because unlike conservationists working on rhinos and tigers, poachers aren't out racing us trying to find the last tigers and rhinos and bears.
Right.
Nobody's actually really going out trying to kill Saola. It's just being caught up in the general slaughter. But the problem is, as these other animals that are valued decline, like pangolins and turtles and tigers and bears and everything else, the prices go up. So the demand, so then that's even more motivation for these poachers to go out in the forest and find the last ones. And the prices are extraordinary. There's a little box turtle, basically endemic to the Annamite Mountains, about this big. It's a terrestrial turtle.
The coin turtle?
Yeah, golden coin turtle.
Yeah.
Golden coin turtle, yeah, in the genus Cura. So, up in the mountains, Lao villagers, they aren't really tied into a cash economy, and they might earn $1,000 a year, maybe $2,000 a year from selling. If they just do legal activities like selling a cow or some bamboo shoots they collected, they might earn $1,000. If they do a little bit of illegal selling of wood, and timber, they'll earn more. But a Lao villager can sell one of these turtles to a wildlife trader for $30,000 in cash.
Wait, 30,000 US?
$30,000 in cash is what they can get. Last I knew.
Holy shit.
As we're talking today, it might be $40,000.
What is so valued about the turtle? There's
different cultural aspects of its value in China. One that we know of is it's believed to cure cancer. I think if the blood is injected intravenously, it's believed to kill tumors. And you can imagine, Daniel, if the Lao villager sells it to like a Vietnamese wildlife trader in Laos, then he sells it to somebody else, like a middleman in Vietnam, and then he sells it up to somebody in the Chinese border. By the time some billionaire Chinese industrialist dying of pancreatic cancer in Beijing buys it, he might be paying $200,000 for it, or $300,000. I mean, who knows? So this demand is emptying the forests of Asia and now Africa and other parts of the world, empty of most of its terrestrial wildlife. Turtles, reptiles. There's some value for almost any mammal. So in Saola is just getting caught up in this.
Is there any part of that dynamic that's similar to in a hopeful thought? Obviously it's because of a terrible reason, but in a hopeful thought for the Saola, that like when the wolves were wiped out of Yellowstone and all of a sudden all the ungulates just kind of took over because there was nothing taking out their population, is the lower population density of things like tigers in these rainforests helpful to the Saola at all, just because they're not getting hunted at all?
No, the humans have replaced humans have overwhelmingly replaced all the predation pressure that might have come from some tigers or leopards.
Well, that's what's crazy is I saw...
Because here's the thing. I mean, one team of poachers, they'll go into the forest. And then, I've been with patrol teams that we've arrested these guys. Like say 4 or 5 guys will come over from Vietnam to Laos, or they'll do it in Vietnam. But so the difference is Laos and Vietnam lie side by side. And the Annamite Mountains form the border between the two countries. Mm-hmm. They're roughly the same size. I mean, Vietnam is bigger, but not massively bigger. But there's 100 million people in Vietnam, really connected to a business economy. There's only about 6.5 million people in Laos. So the pressure on the resource is much higher in Vietnam. So most of the forests in Vietnam are largely empty already. So the Vietnamese have been just walking through the forest on trails to Laos. So most of the commercial poaching pressure in the Annamite Mountains is coming across the border. And, a team of Vietnamese guys will go into the forest and they'll maybe spend a week and they'll set probably tens of thousands of these wire snares. Just one team of guys. And then they go back home to their village and they come back and check the snare line maybe once a month, hoping that whatever has been caught in the snare line and died of stress and thirst after a few days is still valuable. For example, for cats, it's mainly the bones, like the smaller cats.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how rotted the carcass is, they can still get the bones from it. If they get a deer with the antlers, they can still use the antlers. There's a tremendous amount of waste. There's a lot of pheasants caught that are just rotted and thrown away.
It's also like
all sorts of stuff.
It's an atrocity on so many different levels, but
it's an animal welfare issue also.
Yeah, there's no worse way. You're literally just letting something suffer and die for a month at a time before you go out and find it. It's putting me in a bad place thinking about that.
In 2010, in Laos, villagers snared a Saola, and because of conservation awareness activities of the Saola working group we'd been working with villagers in this area, they didn't kill it. Normally they would have just killed it and eaten it. But they didn't kill it. They made like a little fence for it in the forest near the village, and they released it into this little fence. And they sent one of the villagers, they sent a runner down 2 days walk to the nearest district town, and they notified the government authorities that they had this Saola in their village.
Wow.
So we in the Wildlife Conservation Society, who had a project in that area, we worked with the government to scramble a team to go back, just with instructions to take measurements of the animal and let it go. And so it took them 2 days to get back. So now you're talking about 4 days. And they got there at nightfall and took some photographs, which I can send you and you can post.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
It was an adult male Saola.
It was still alive by the time they got there?
Yeah, it was still alive, and they got up in the morning with the intention to release it, and it was dead in the morning.
Oh, my God.
And I subsequently went back, and other members of our team, this great Lao guy, Ole, went back, and we interviewed the hunters that actually caught it. And they estimate it had already been in the snare for 3 days when they found it. So even the world's best wildlife veterinarian may not have been able to save it after 3 days of stress and thirst. And
I went to the San Francisco International Ocean Film Festival a couple weeks ago, and they were premiering that movie Sharkwater Extinction, which is one of the best wildlife films that I've seen in a really long time. And I'm blanking on the name of the guy who made it, but I'll link in the show notes. He actually tragically passed away diving pretty recently. But he was an incredible conservationist. I'm mad at myself for blanking on his name, but I'll link it in the show notes. But he did an undercover kind of filming at night. They went out in a small like Cessna, like one person prop plane, and they found where they were putting all these drift nets right off of Los Angeles. And they went out at night and just started swimming along the drift nets and actually got shot at, which is kind of a crazy part of the documentary. But they just show these sharks that got caught in these drift nets, and just seeing these things just like slowly die
off the coast of it.
Off the coast of Los Angeles. Yes. That's what's so messed up about it.
Is this for the shark fin market? Were they trying to get sharks?
You know what? A lot of I don't know. No, because it was drift net. So they were trying to get tuna or something like that. And It's just like,
what were they Americans? Or?
Yeah. So it's American. So Sea Legacy just had a huge program against it. California, for as progressive of a state as we're supposed to be, still allowed drift nets. I think it's starting to go away, but I'm not positive. But it's basically, they were trying to catch tuna or whatever the hell it was, but they're catching everything, by the way. Yeah. So you find these huge, majestic sharks that are sitting there and drowning and just dying for 5, 6, 7 hours before they actually go out. So like the idea of this Saola or like a tiger just sitting there and like these majestic creatures just slowly dying for days is something that's like, keeps you up, man. That's brutal.
And it's particularly tragic in the Annamite Mountains because, when Saola was discovered in 1992, actually I was in Laos when it was discovered. I remember opening an English language newspaper, and there was this photograph announcing the discovery of this new animal in Vietnam. And I remember looking at the little map showing where they found it right on the Lao border. I said, that thing's in Laos for sure. And like 3 days later, I was down there. Around. But biologists started looking more closely at the Annamite Mountains, and it's been amazing. Especially my colleague, Rob Timmons, I hope you can have on your show at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to.
He was involved in the discovery of 2 new species of barking deer in the Annamite Mountains.
Oh, wow.
Muntjacs. There's been a new primate, a new monkey found in the Annamites, a new species of rabbit. Rob found an entirely new family of mammal, a bizarre family of rodent. A lot of these discoveries have come in fresh food markets. Like he found this beautiful tiger-striped rabbit in a fresh food market. And this is a pace of the discovery of distinctive large mammals and birds. Rob also found a new species of bald songbird. It looks like a little tiny bald ibis or vulture, but it's a songbird.
Crazy.
This is unmatched by any region in the world in, I don't know, the last century or half a century. And most of these things are endemic to the Annamite Mountains. And anything walking on the ground, like one of the new species of deer, large antlered muntjac, is already critically endangered on the IUCN Red List because of this poaching. So it's not just Saola that's the one thing special in the Annamite Mountains that's being wiped out by this. There's a whole there's a whole lot of stuff, and species we barely know anything about,
or haven't found yet.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that's
who knows what's else still out there.
That's why they don't call it empty Saola syndrome. They call it the empty forest syndrome. It's messed up, and that's why I was super. I don't know if it was in an article that you were mentioned in, or it was a large publication that showed through the efforts of, I think it was the Saola Working Group, which you founded, that it wasn't like, I was like, oh yeah, maybe they'll find a couple hundred snares over the course of 5 years. I was like, oh no, they've discovered 200,000 snares over the course of the last year or something like that. It's right. The numbers are inordinate.
That was a couple Saola Working Group members. I think Tom Gray was the lead author on that paper. I mean, it's staggering. I mean, what you'll do is you go in the forest and you'll find sometimes one snare line. So what they do is they come in, these poachers, they'll build a little crude brush fence. They'll just cut up some saplings and brush, and they don't weave anything real elaborate, but they make this little brush fence, maybe, waist high or knee high. And some of these brush fences will go up a mountainside or along a ridge line, where animals tend to cross, for half a mile, maybe a mile in some cases. And about every 10 feet, they put an opening in the brush fence and they put a wire snare there. They're made out of like bicycle brake cable. And so some of these single snare lines will have 300 snares in them, stretched out for half a mile or mile, all the way across the mountainside. Any animal, a muntjac or a Saola or a small cat comes along there and they hit the brush fence and they just walk down and looking for an opening. Every opening's got a snare in it. Alan Rabinowitz, who passed away recently, this biologist he was the guy who hired me to work in Laos years ago. He used to call them the walls of death. That's what he called these drift fences.
Do they catch people at all?
No. I stepped in one that was set for tigers and bears, and it was quite a close call because the most common snare is the snare is only about that big around, and it's made out of just thin bicycle brake cable.
Okay.
And it's on a sapling, maybe, that big around is like the spring pole.
Got it.
So it's enough to hold, and I've even seen areas like wild pigs have been able to bust out of them. You see something all ripped up and the snare has been broken off. It's probably a wild pig. But what they also do, they set much bigger ones made out of, like truck winch cable for wild cattle, bears, tigers, leopards, things like that. And I stepped in one of those once, and it was quite fortunate because I was with some guides. We were doing a survey in the Annamites in Laos, and just following this little bit of a game trail. And I always go in front because I want to be the one to see if we flush an animal or the monkey or a bird, that I can identify it.
Yeah.
So I'm always looking up. I'm not looking at the ground. So I'm always in the front looking up. And this is how, most of us do our surveys. And suddenly I found myself, my foot stepped in a hole and I'm suddenly sitting on my ass on the trail and the Lao guys are running over to this big tree that sprung up. And I don't even know what happened. It all happened so quickly. What happened was I stepped right on a snare set for large mammals made out of this truck winch cable on this incredibly strong sapling about 3-4 inches in diameter, 3 inches in diameter, that was bent over as a spring pole. But what happened is I stepped on on the wire itself. So half of my foot was in the center of the snare and half of it was outside. And what they do is this is how they do all the snares. They dig a little bit of a hole in the ground, and then they build like kind of this little false roof on it out of a little piece of woven bamboo, like flat bamboo that they just weave. Mm-hmm. And then they put the snare on top of that, and then they sprinkle some leaves and dirt on it. And then they've got like a little trigger mechanism. They can bend the snare down to it on this spring pole, and it's held there under tension. And when a foot or your paw, if you're an animal, steps on that spot, it plunges down through the hole and the snare jumps up on your leg and it sets off the spring pole, which pulls you, partway off the ground. So that's what I did. I set the snare off, but it went out from under my foot instead of up in my ankle. But the guide said, William, you're lucky because this would have broken your ankle because the spring. And then we went down the trail. We went down the trail a little bit farther, looking more carefully. We found like 3 or 4 more of these on the trail. And man, it was impressive. I mean, you set these off, that thing just goes whang!
Oh my
like this
God,
with an incredible amount of force and pressure. I mean, and we tested. It takes 2 guys to pull it down and bend the tree in which the sapling that they cut to bend it down. It takes 2 guys to bend it down and set it. So imagine the force that's being held there. It's cruelly ingenious. And
you said you've captured a group of guys doing this before. What was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, multiple times.
How does that work? Like, are they armed? Are you armed?
It depends.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are. Often they're not. One, I was in camp with all the Lao guys, and 2 of the most memorable ones. We were out with a Lao patrol team, or we were out doing a survey with villagers. And I was with this herpetologist, Brian Stewart, and we had with us what's called the village militia guys. So these are villages that are authorized by the government to have a gun. They usually have AK-47s because they're kind of responsible for security around the remote village. And they would always be assigned to go with us if we're going into these remote areas near the Vietnam border, kind of like a protection detail.
Yeah.
They also assigned a local policeman to go with us from like down in the town. It was this kind of old guy, and Brian was really irritated with him because he refused to help carry any food or anything. He just said, that's not my job. And he was always kind of just wrapped up in a little scarf because it was cold that time of year. And Brian nicknamed him Grandma. He said, God, Grandma's just worthless. He doesn't do anything, doesn't carry anything. He's just eating, another mouth to feed. Because extra mouths to feed when you're on a survey in the forest is significant because you got to carry all your rice and everything.
For sure.
So again, we're walking along, and I'm the head of the line watching for wildlife, and I hear a chopping noise coming up ahead in the forest and the trail. And I stop. I said, hey, you guys, it sounds like chopping noise. And Grandma comes running up from the back of the line. He listens, and he just springs into action. I don't know where he'd had it for like the last 5 days, but he pulls out this 9mm. Grandma stepped in. Grandma pulled out this 9mm pistol he had, and he said, William, you stay here. Brian, you stay here. Don't move. And you could tell the village militia guys, they're just villagers, they looked a little bit nervous. He said, you guys come with me. And they snuck up there. And they found 5 Vietnamese setting a snare line, and they arrested them all. We kept them in camp for a day. And Grandma didn't fool around. What he did, because this is what happens. We've caught other Vietnamese poachers before, and you maybe got 2-3 guys, and you start walking them back to your camp, and they're speaking Vietnamese, which I don't I speak Lao, and the Lao guys do. But they whisper, and suddenly they'll just, on signal, they'll run off in opposite directions through the forest. And you can't chase them all, and that's what they do. Grandma knew this. He lined them all up. He took their snare wire and he tied them neck to neck with their own snare wire. Whoa. I mean, not choking them. But just tied them together in a line so that nobody could run off. And then he marched them back to camp, and we kept them tied up in camp for a day. And then he walked them and turned them over to the border police on the border.
What are the repercussions for something like that?
Well, what they did is the border police, sometimes they put them through the court system, they put them down in jail in a district town. In this case, the border police, they did a clever thing. I think there were 5 of them. They let 3 of them, they fined each of them $100, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they let 3 of them go back to Vietnam to their villages to raise the money, and they kept 2 there. And they said, look, when you come back with the $500 in total fines, we'll let your 2 friends go.
Wow.
The other one was in the same area is typically, we're in camp with the guides and the villagers, and while they were making breakfast, I just went out looking for birds in the forest around camp. So I said, all right, I'm just going to go do some bird surveys. and I'll come back to eat, when I figure the food's ready. So I'm, in the forest, just looking around away from camp, and I see these two Vietnamese poachers. I knew who they were, and they had these big packs on, and they're like walking through the forest. I don't know if they're armed or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just crouched down and hid. And then they turned and they started coming right down the little trail I was on, that I'm hiding alongside of it.
Oh.
And they're coming right at me. And they're like 6 feet away. They're going to see me in another step. So I just stood up, and we're out in the middle of nowhere. We're like 2 days walk from the nearest Lao village.
Yeah.
And I don't know how far from the nearest. And so this white guy stands up, and I just said in Lao, "Sabadi." I said hello in Lao, or maybe I said hello in Vietnamese. I speak a bit. Of course, they jumped about 10 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
And then immediately, as I remember, they spoke some Lao, because often they do a lot of trading with Lao villagers. So the Vietnamese guy, they often speak some Lao. And so immediately they started saying in Lao, they said, oh, we don't have any wildlife. We don't have any wildlife. We're not hunting. And they put their packs down, and they opened their packs to show me. They said, we're not hunting. We're not hunting. And I look in their pack, and on the top of one guy's pack is his machete. So I just grabbed his machete and took it out. And I thought, I'm now the only one armed here. So I just kind of threatened him with the machete. And I said, I'm taking you back to our camp. And I got out their cord that they string up their hammocks with, and I tied them together just around their waist, and the next guy around their waist. I don't remember how I did this, but I got them to tie themselves together, and I said, all right, head this way. And they kept whispering in Vietnamese and trying to undo their knots, and I kept kind of tapping them on the shoulder and said, don't say anything, and tapping their hand away. I could tell they were planning to untie their knots. And I don't know if they were going to try to jump me or run into the forest.
Yeah.
So what's weird, I've spent a lot of time in the forest in Wisconsin and Laos, and I have a horrible sense of direction. I'm not that gene is missing in my brain. And I'm going back, wondering if these guys are going to try to jump me and get the machete back. And I realized, crap, where's camp? I don't know if I'm headed towards camp. And I got these two Vietnamese guys, and God. And I just kept thinking, no, I think it's this way. I think it's this way.
And you were by yourself?
20 minutes. Yeah.
2 days out. So
20 minutes later,
So did they have snares on them, or did they, with the machete, how did you know they were definitely poachers?
Who else is going to be camped out in the middle of the forest they're not going camping.
Yeah.
They're out either harvesting timber illegally or wildlife. They're after something. They're not just out collecting bamboo shoots. Fortunately, after about 20 minutes, I remember seeing the wisp of our smoke fire climbing up through the trees, and I was so relieved. But the Lao guys they were all excited when I walked into camp with these two poachers that I caught. They were all happy. So.
Yeah, that's a different experience than you were probably expecting going out there trying to spot some wildlife, and you come back with a couple poachers.
Yeah.
What is having spent so much time on the grounds there and having a unique understanding of the grassroots situation of what's going on socially and economically in those areas, what do you see as potential solutions? Is there anything that gives you hope as to how do you stop people from going into these forests and setting these snares and poaching these animals?
Yeah, I think there's three answers to that question. One is, for a long-term solution, you have to solve it at the demand end.
Yeah,
there has to be a cultural change in China where these increasingly numbers of wealthy Chinese millionaires and billionaires don't get social capital by buying wildlife, and the opposite happens. And actually, this group based in San Francisco, Wild Aid, is doing great work on that. They're doing these television spots with Yao Ming, the NBA basketball.
Yeah, that's a crazy
thing. China.
The shark fin soup from his one commercial went down 80% or something crazy like that.
Yeah,
90%.
So and I love Wild Aid's work, and that actually has to be done. But that also takes a generation. For those attitudes to change can take it. It's not overnight in any case, whether it's a generation or not. what we're doing in the Saola working group is trying to keep some of these last animals alive until that generational change can kick in. So Wild Aid is working on it on the demand side. Other conservation organizations in Vietnam and Laos are working it on the supply side by patrolling and everything else. The other thing, Daniel, is, so that's one thing. And what the strategy in the Saola working group is to focus on, you have to do a core zone approach. If you try to save all of the Annamites with the resources we have, you're going to lose everything. We're going to have to focus on just a handful of priority areas.
Yeah.
Really lock those down against poaching. Our goal is what we call zero threat. And the goal is that somebody could walk into that forest for a specific period of time, maybe 3 days, 2 days, and not find a single snare, a single hunter with a gun, or a single hunter with a hunting dog, because Saola is very susceptible to being hunted with dogs. And we need to get it close to that zero threat. And then the idea is you put all your patrolling resources in those areas. And yeah, the poachers are going to go elsewhere, and they're going to go to the less patrolled areas and hammer the wildlife there. That's not great, but at least in these core areas, you'll save viable populations of most things. Mm-hmm. If you try to just do enforcement and patrolling over even all the protected areas in the Annamite Mountains, we're trying that now and we're losing everything in these areas. So it's that the core zone approach, pushing the poaching pressure to other areas, and just, those areas are, have to be on their own. For Saola, it's also now essential to start a captive breeding program for the animal winks out in the wild. So we're really scrambling to get a captive breeding center set up. And then these core areas, while we're establishing a secure population of Saolas in captivity, we'll work on getting the poaching in these other areas down to zero, so you have a safe place to reintroduce Saolas 15 or 20 years from now. And the advantage of that approach also is, while you're securing these areas for Saola reintroductions, you're probably saving viable populations, a lot of things that are disappearing that aren't being captive bred. The rabbits and these rare civets and all sorts of stuff. So.
And what is the understood range on the Saola? Like, do you have a sense of, if you preserve a certain area of forest, that they'll typically stay within that area of forest?
Yeah, and we don't know that. We have to learn. What we'd love to do is get a radio collar on one and learn more about its home range size, which we haven't done yet. And that's a bit of a dicey call. If we catch one, if we can find one and capture one, do we bring it into captivity, or do we put a radio collar on it? I think you bring it into captivity. If you catch a few, then you can put a radio collar on one. The other advantage is, and I think hope for Saola, is there's no economic opportunity cost for villagers really for its conservation. If you go up in these villages and say, give them some turtle conservation posters and say, look, don't pick up and sell a turtle worth $30,000 next time you see one. That's a very hard ask. Yeah. I mean, Christ, if I see one of these turtles on a survey, I'd be tempted. Not that I would do it, but I just want to make that clear.
But to be honest, I thought the same thing. Obviously, I would never do it, but there's something about.
That's a hard ask for a poor villager. Well, which is called poor. But what's cool about Saola is, what you have to understand is, Laos is still listed as one of the world's least developed countries, which is really unfortunate. That's a really shaming message, I think.
Yeah.
The label that it's known as is the United Nations Development Program category of least developed country. That's arbitrary. You could have called Laos one of the world's most culturally intact country. There's probably more than 200 languages spoken in Laos. You could have called it one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, whatever. Instead, it's got stuck with this shaming label. And so the Lao know this, they don't like this. And then you have the villagers up in the mountains who don't even speak Lao as their first language. And they're kind of looked down on by the urban elites.
Yeah.
And so for years, well-meaning staff of whoever, World Bank projects, UN, Lao government, have been going to these villages. And these villages live in one of the most rich biodiverse forest on the planet.
Yeah.
They can get everything from the forest that other people in the city have to pay cash for. And it's going in with a message of lack that, oh, you don't have money, so you're really poor. And you don't have a lot of stuff like people down in the big cities like Bangkok and Vientiane and Hanoi. And we have to bring you a project so you can get this stuff. And that's basically a message of lack. When we go into a village, we say, you have something, the Saola, that the rest of the world doesn't, and the rest of the world is really interested in. And Daniel, you can just see the paradigm. They never had that international perspective on Saola. So, I've been in villages where the village headman talking to him, and he says, "Oh, William, you're from America, and there must be a lot of Saolas in America, huh?" Yeah, I said, "No, Uncle, there aren't any Saolas in America." And he said, "Well, I heard about this country called Africa once, that there's like wild animals running all over the place. There must be a lot of Saolas in Africa." And I said, "No, Uncle, there aren't any Saolas in Africa." I said, "There aren't even any Saolas next door to Laos in Cambodia or Thailand or China.
Yeah.
In fact, there aren't even any Saolas in the other provinces of Laos. The only place there are Saola in the entire world is those forests behind your village here."
Yeah.
They never knew this. And you give them that perspective, and I've seen villagers get proud to have Saola, and you just ask them, say, "Look, next time you're out with your hunting dogs and a wild pig jumps up and you want to shoot the wild pig, I'm not going to tell you not to do that. If you put up your gun and you see it's a Saola, please just don't pull the trigger." And they're willing to do that because they can't make a lot of money from Saola. They don't. It's not an important source of food. They're not going to starve to death if they don't kill a Saola. So the capacity to engage villagers in its conservation is also, there's a lot of potential there, which I think has hope for saving it as well.
Yeah, on a complete aside, like to your point about labeling it as one of the least developed countries or something to that effect, I also hate that when you think of it like philosophically, the idea of development and the idea of progress and becoming technologically and industrially advanced is so arbitrary because nobody really understands why we're here, what we're doing. Yeah. So the concept of like making more money and being more advanced and being more developed, right. I think that's really important when it comes to the health and well-being of the people. But outside of that, there's really nothing outside of like our own concept of what we've deemed as important that says that that's more important to living your life. And that's why, they look at people who are in less quote unquote developed areas, and a lot of times they're happier people than people who live in these amazing places. So I just hate that. It's one thing to have the stigma amongst ourselves and almost like feel like, but it's another thing to like perpetuating the shame on people for doing things that there's nothing inherently wrong or shameful about. And in fact, it might be a more natural and better way to be living, period. So it's just, I don't know. It's just something that really rubs me the wrong way when you hear that. It's sad to hear that isn't only a message that we're hearing, but they're hearing as well. You know what I mean?
Can I send you something else to post along with the story?
Yeah, of course.
I have this brilliant colleague who works mainly in Thailand on wildlife conservation, Dr. Rob Steinmetz. And years ago, I was tasked with doing a review of the protected area system in Laos. And I invited Rob to write a little text box on this concept of poverty, development, and conservation. And he wrote this really poignant perspective of just a few paragraphs on this. And I'll send just that little piece to you and you can post it. I have this remarkable anthropologist friend who's based in Laos. He's been working he was married for the first time in Laos in 1966. Gives you a chance of perspective how well he knows the country. He's a scholar of the Lao and Thai language family. And he discovered he was working for, I think it was the Asian Development Bank in these villages in Laos, and he helped them study their economy for like 3 years. And in the first year, they grew enough food to feed themselves. They had enough rice. Everything was fine. In the second year, they grew enough food and rice to feed themselves. They had enough to eat. Everything was fine. In the third year, they grew enough to feed themselves. They had enough rice and food and everything was fine. And the Asian Development Bank labeled them as impoverished because there was no economic growth. And
Yeah.
he pointed this out in the report that he wrote to him, how silly this was. And as I understand it, the Asian Development Bank required him to delete that from the final report.
Oh, wow.
So this whole thing that, and what I see it is some of the governments, there's almost, there's two things going on. In the Saola range in Laos, there are people who are hunter-gatherers up until the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
They were, in fact, this friend of mine, the anthropologist Jim Chamberlain, he went into the Saola range while we were looking for new species of deer and rabbits and everything else, and he discovered like 4 new languages in one protected area in Laos, in the Kainan Tun. 4 ethnic groups that, people knew there were villages there, but nobody actually went to the village and just discovered, my God, these people speak a language that's not described, and they call themselves, they're an unknown ethnic group. And then the well-meaning, of course, the Lao government, so, we have to move these people down to villages, and they have to learn to grow food, and they can't just be living in the forest, eating roots and berries and things. The problem is they don't adapt to village life, and these ethnic groups, some of them only had like 30 people, and they've been dying off in these other villages, just from depression, and they're not tied to agriculture, they're hunter-gatherers basically. So there was a group of about 12 of these that were in a village, and they were not doing well, and the World Bank was involved, and again, a well-meaning way, related to development of hydropower project nearby. And the World Bank wanted to give the government to give these people self-determination. So they asked like these 20 people, what do you want to do? They said, we just want to be allowed to go back and live in our ancestral territory in the forest. The World Bank, I think, said fine. The anthropologist said fine. Boy, the government, Lao government guys were so resistant to this. And we were having this running kind of debate and discussion for days. And like at one point, this guy said, you have to understand, this consultant said, these people have a right to be civilized. And I said, what do you mean a right to be civilized? They're dying. What good is, And so finally, after about 3 days of this, the penny dropped. And I was with a Lao colleague who I really like and respect a lot. And I asked him, I said, Paulin, I want to ask you something. You're labeled by the world, Laos, unfortunately, as one of the world's least developed countries. It's actually a very rich country in resources, biodiversity, culture, everything. I hate that. Anyway, like you.
Yeah.
I said, is it embarrassing for you in the government to have people still living in the forest? He said, it's very embarrassing. It was a thing of shame. The Lao government thought it was shameful to still have people living this lifestyle not connected to development. And I tried to explain to him, I said, actually, the most progressive countries in the world today are the ones that give the most rights of self-determination to their indigenous people, whether it's Aborigines in Australia or American Indians in the US. The degree to which to give self-determination to indigenous people is actually considered a sign of progress.
Yeah.
But for them, I can understand it. They're very ashamed to have undeveloped people still running around their country, and they're desperate to change that. And these people are suffering. Or as another colleague, Troy Hansel, points it out, the Lao government knows they're going to have to go through a stressful period with a lot of people. They may die to get to a point where they actually can be absorbed into the culture. But that's another part of the country. I've seen the Lao government, I think, do it really well. Last I knew, there's a group called the Mabri, I forgot their name. They live in the western side of Laos, hunter-gatherers. And what the government authorities did there is they just made available to them a village supplies of food and clothing and maybe some tools. And they said, look, just do what you want in the forest. If you're ever in trouble or if you're hungry, there's a disaster, a flood, come to the village and all these resources are here for you to make use of. And I think that's a nice approach to it. Yeah.
Well, there was a really interesting podcast. This is kind of taking this to a weird sci-fi level, but I listened to this podcast with Elon Musk on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was explaining how I mean, basically we are, most people who have iPhones or smartphones, like we're a very archaic version of cyborg, and the fact that we're consistently interfacing with technology. But Elon's working on this new stuff that's going to be the first, like you biologically program technology into you as a human being, where all of a sudden we're going to create these like species of human who now interface with this technology to become like almost like a new species of superhuman. And I think there's going to be a weird point in time where there's going to be a lot of folks who are like, I don't want to embed a chip into my body. I don't want to start interfacing through the world via like machinery and technology. And in a weird divergence, it's like taking it a step back. It's like, to people who want to live in the forest and live their life and are happy, there's nothing wrong with that if you don't want to join the civilized society. In the same way that if I'm in a civilized society, I don't like using the word civilized, but just for the term civilization.
Sure.
But if I don't want to eventually like interface with a chip that goes into my brain, I should be allowed to not do that. You know what I mean? It's like, at what point do I have to keep going?
It's not going to be mandatory.
But I mean, if culturally, like it'll get there, you know what I mean? Eventually, who knows? Like, I know I'm getting a little like science fiction, but there's a point in time where like when you put yourself in the shoes of like, how could this same thing happen to me? You're like, oh, I totally get it. Maybe it's just something, maybe that's considered quote unquote development, but I don't want to be a part of it, you know?
Sure. It was probably 30 years ago, or I was reading, they asked the futurist to sum up what the future, what was fundamentally, how was the future going to look? And this, like I said, was 30 years ago. This was even before iPhones. And I think from what you're saying, he nailed it on the head. He said, what the future is going to look like is machines are going to be more like people and living things and people are going to be more like machines.
Yeah.
And they're going to kind of blur and meet in the middle. And that's what you see in Japan. They have robot pets now. You don't have a cat anymore. You have a robot for a pet. Yeah, and now we're getting chips in our... That was quite... Well, that's why he's a futurist. He was good at his job.
Yeah, but that's a weird concept. But to bring it back a little bit and rein it in, because I'm going off on a tangent here. For folks who do want to see how beautiful Laos is and get a sense of the culture and biodiversity, I highly, highly recommend
Vietnam.
Vietnam, yeah. Okay. I was just gonna say my idol has always been Anthony Bourdain. Is like, absolutely love him, and he did an episode in Laos, and
I know the guys who helped him.
Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, I think he always does a really good job, or did a really good job of coming to new places with no expectations, just learning from people, understanding their way of being. And the Laos episode in particular is a really beautiful episode. So I'll link that in the show notes too, for people to check out.
And I think that's where he encountered one of the few things he couldn't eat or swallow, which is these, speaking of swallow, is these fermented swallows that the Lao catch and then make. It was actually one of the few things he ever had to spit out.
It's like, I can't do this.
Even he couldn't eat it.
Yeah, man, he was a great man. You had mentioned, to bring it back to the Saola, you had mentioned that you spent 3 weeks with one before. What was that like, and what did you learn in those 3 weeks?
Wow. So I was in Laos. I was coordinating the conservation or the country program for the Bronx Zoo Wildlife Conservation Society, and at the time there was a General Chang, who just passed away fairly recently. He basically controlled everything in these two provinces of central Laos in the Annamite Mountains, Khamun and Bole Kamsai. And he was very interested in wildlife. In fact, Rob Timmons and I discovered, and others, we discovered a new species of deer in his little menagerie, one of these new muntjacs we first spotted in his little zoo in this town of Lac Sao. And so he had this keen amateur interest in wildlife, and it was actually in the market in that little town that Rob discovered the new species of rabbit. So that was this little town called Lac Sao, which means kilometer 20, was this little incredible center of wildlife discovery in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Wow.
So General Chang, when he realized this incredible new mammal was in his operational area, he put out a reward to villagers for $1,000, a huge amount of money in the late 1990s if anyone could catch a Saola for his little zoo in his compound. And in January 1996, some Hmong villagers succeeded, and they sent a runner down to the town of Laos, and General Chang flew up one of his helicopters that he was using for logging, actually helicopter logging, but he picked up the Saola and brought it back. And two of our staff working for WCS, Matt Eder and Nancy Ruggieri, they were just getting to Lac Sao that evening, coming out of the forest, and they saw this animal. They got back to Vientiane that night, told us about it. And Alan Rabinowitz and I were actually down there the next day. And Alan was my boss, and I asked him permission just to drop everything and just stay down there watching and observing the animal, because it was the first adult Saola I ever seen by the outside world. So I just watched around the clock, and she was held in this small pen, just concrete floor. And the most remarkable thing, Daniel, she was completely tame around people. She had exhibited no fear of humans. Now, there is this thing called post-capture myopathy, where you bring a wild animal in captivity and it's so freaked out and stressed, it acts sort of tame, but it's basically it's fried and
freaking out on the inside.
Freaking out on the inside. But I've shown people pictures of Martha. I mean, zoo guys who know this really well, and described it to them. And they said, no, this doesn't sound like myopathy. It's something else going on. Because she was very afraid of dogs. Any dog that came near the pen, she would freak out. She fed from your hand. She would groom herself. She kept flies off of her. She drank. She wasn't just like freaked out. Yeah, she may have been stressed, but then, other local Lao were coming to watch her with me because they were interested to see a Saola. And, I asked them, I said, why is she so tame? And this Hmong hunter, and the Hmong are really good naturalists, the Hmong, ethnic group up in Laos. And this Hmong hunter said, the only thing Saola is afraid of is dogs. And then this other Lao guy said, oh yeah, we got a nickname for Saola. We call it the Satsupap, which means the polite animal. I said, why do you call it that? And they said, because Saola they said they're Jai Yin, which means they're very cool-hearted or cool-headed. He said they just always walk slowly and quietly through the forest, and they never freak out at anything. And they said when they're chased by hunting dogs, they run down to a stream and they just stand in the water and they fight off the hunting dogs. That's their strategy. They say when they do that, they're so focused on the dogs, you can just walk up to them and grab them by the horns, or just throw a rope around their neck and lead them back to the village. And that's how they caught this one. So she was extraordinary in that way. 2 days of captivity, and there were deer and this thing called a siro, which is a sort of a wild goat that had been in the menagerie for a year. Mm-hmm. And that thing, you'd approach its pen and would run to the other side. You couldn't touch it. The Saola, I was measuring her just with a tape measure when she's standing up 2 days after her captivity. WCS, the Wildlife Conservation, flew out its wildlife veterinarian, Billy Karras, to examine her. He arrived in Laos a couple days later, gave her an examination, a couple of weeks later, and to him, she seemed fine. And we met with General Chang, and he gave her some advice on her husbandry and care. And Billy flew back to New York, and she died like 48 hours later. And I think it was something wrong with her gut, because she started having diarrhea about 24 hours before she died. There was a local vet in another project who we think gave her an injection of an antibiotic because she had a little bite wound or an eye infection. If it's the wrong antibiotic, that, as I understand, that could kill all the gut flora, of a ruminant, and then they can't digest their food. And so we don't know. We now know of about 10 or maybe 10 Saolas that have been held in captivity, and none of them lived more than a few months. But none of them ever been kept in professional care. They've all been kept by villagers or just forestry staff or General Chang's crew. So we're still confident we can keep them in a captive breeding program successfully, because we'll have actually experts in the care of wild hoofstock doing this. Is there any plan in place to kind of get that rolling? Yeah, in fact, I'm flying to Vietnam on Monday. We're doing the big launch ceremony with the government of Vietnam for the program, having a national meeting. So the government of Vietnam has agreed; they're all in, and they've allocated it's either 40 or 60 hectares in Bac Ma National Park in central Vietnam. And that's where the Saola working group is going to work with the government of Vietnam we're working with them now to develop the captive breeding center. And then we're going to put both this critically endangered deer, the large antlered muntjac, and Saola in the captive breeding center. Oh, wow. So what we're focused on now is a lot of detection research to try to find the last Saolas. And the Lao government has always also agreed to it. It's going to be a cooperative transboundary program. So we're heavily involved in an intense program of research to find the last Saolas. First, to protect them, to know where to focus the patrolling resources to keep the last ones alive, and then to eventually send in capture teams to capture them for the captive breeding program.
Oh, that's amazing.
So that's moving forward quite quickly. The main constraint now is money. We're desperately trying to raise the money. It's not going to be cheap to do this, as you might imagine. So.
Where are you raising? Is there any way listeners can support?
Sure, you can go to the Saola Working Group's website, which is www.savethesaola.org, and hit the donate button. Yeah, and what's tremendous, we've gotten what I think is really laudable. We've gotten a tremendous amount of support from zoos around the world. So there's no Saola in any zoo in the world, and no zoo in Europe or America is going to get one anytime soon. I mean, they're all going to be held in Laos or Vietnam. But zoos really recognize, it's not just, it's partly altruistic, partly self-interest. They really have to show their visitors that they're not just keeping animals in pens, that they're actually contributing to the conservation of animals in the wild. Often they tie their conservation support and giving to animals they have in their zoo collections. That's what's so cool about Saola. We have 20 or more zoos around the world helping to support this program. None of them have a Saola, none of them are going to get one. So it's the support of zoos has been quite inspirational.
Yeah, good luck. That's fantastic. I encourage anybody who can help to support. I always think it's fantastic when I've spoken to a few people on the podcast. There's rare times where I remember in the Racing Extinction documentary, this is a good way to start. I'm trying to think of how I should phrase this. Louis Tsai-Hoyos, I can never pronounce his last name, Tsai-Hoyos, it's like a Greek name, who directed that. He's being interviewed.
It's worse than Saola.
It's worse than Saola, yeah, exactly. But he's being interviewed and he's talking about the Chinese river dolphin and how he heard back when he was getting started in his career that the Chinese river dolphin, there were only a few hundred left. And he's like, somebody, some group, some organization, some government will take care of this. It's fine. And then sure enough, 10 years later, the last one died and it's now extinct, like gone off this planet, never to be seen again. And he breaks down in the interview and he's like, I just thought someone else would take care of it. And then there's the people who have that, if not me, then who mentality. And when I talked to Jeremy Hance, who connected us about meeting, he's like, I think you should talk to Bill because he is somebody who has spent his bulk of his entire career working with Saola, and he's really one of their last hopes. And I think it's incredible when individuals take it upon themselves to save entire species of animals. And it's been proven time and time again that sometimes it's a small collection of people. It's not a government. It's not China. It's not Vietnam. Right. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just people like yourself who take it on their own shoulders and are like, I'm not going to let this happen. And I don't know, from me, and I'm sure from a lot of other people, thank you for all of that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, who was it who said, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world? It's the only thing that ever has.
I like that.
I want to put a shout out. We have 34 members in the Saola working group, and every one of them is committed to this as I am. It's a remarkable gathering of people who are working their butts off to get this done. And it's not easy for them or for us, because I spent 3 weeks with a Saola 23 years ago. I have the most experience with a living Saola than anybody in the group. It's not like cheetah conservationists. They go out there, well, God bless them. They go out their door in East Africa and there's their species running around. Most of the members of the Saola working group who are working their tails off have never seen one. So that's really inspiring that they get up and do this. And we can't guarantee is this going to work? We don't know. Are there still enough Saolas out there to save? Are we 2 minutes before midnight or 2 minutes after midnight? We don't know. But we have to act as if, because what gets me up in the morning is I feel grateful to live in a time where there is a chance to save this remarkable animal that's been on the planet for 8 million years. And it might be 2 years or 1 year or 6 months from waking out after 8 million years walking the earth. So those of us in the Saola working group, we have an incredible gift of an opportunity that biologists 10 years from now won't have if we don't get this done now. And, the other thing, Daniel, especially Laos, that I know best as a Buddhist country, and the Buddha said no effort is wasted. So what I've learned to do is I give up attachment to outcome. We just get up in the morning, do the next right thing in front of me or in front of us in the Saola working group for Saola, and just trust that it's going to have a good outcome. And that's the best anybody can do in whatever they're involved in.
Well, Godspeed, my friend. I think that's
thank you.
that's incredible. I really hope things go well. I'm super excited to keep tabs on how everything's going. I'm going to link all this in the show notes, and for people listening, please support. And let's definitely try and do this again 6 to 12 months from now and see how things are going from that meeting. And
I'd love to.
That'd be super fun. And thanks so much for all the work that you do. I mean, it's there he is. For people listening, we're holding up the Saola. It is beautiful.
Those forlorn eyes looking in the camera. We need help.
What is that made out of? Is it knit?
This great guy, Brent Huffman, who works at the zoo in Toronto, and he's like an ungulate guy, and he made this for me. He knitted this. Isn't that cool? He gave it to me as a gift.
Oh my God. It's super
This is like only the second Saola I've ever seen. So I keep it on my desk as inspiration. So if Brent watches this video, shout out to Brent for my Saola.
Well, shout out to you and everybody at the Saola working group. Thanks so much for taking the time. To everybody else listening, thank you as well. And until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.